So this is a map of 12.6 acres of land that I bought a couple years ago, and the majority of this property is covered in wetlands and flood zone. So let's take a look at the lay of the land here on this property. So when you look at this property on a GIS map, you see about 12.6 acres in total area, and that area is divided across two sections. One is the 8.98 acre section to the west, which we'll call Tract A, and then there's the 3.63 acre section to the east, which we're going to call Tract B, and those two sections are actually separated by a rail line operated by Norfolk Southern Railroad. And this is a freight line that's not really active. They have a couple trains, maybe 3-4 trains per day. So it's like definitely being used. It's not abandoned, but it's not like round the clock, but it is still a factor. So when you look at the perspective on the street level from Johnson Street, you see a wall of trees to your left, which is the frontage of Tract A onto Johnson Street. And you have about 500 feet of road frontage there. But when you rotate left and you face south, what you see is the highway overpass running east-west as you face due south. When you rotate further to your left, you see the rail lines right across from you, and right beyond the rail lines, that wall of trees is the section of land that we're calling Tract B. Now, when you look at the environmental map for Tract A, what you find is that the vast majority of that part of the property is totally covered in wetlands and flood zone. In fact, when you use the GIS measuring tool, what you see is that of the 8.98 acres, you only have 1.7 acres outside of the flood zone. We're going to get back to that in just a minute, but first what I want to do is show you the environmental map of this property and what each of like the mapped features are on the property, because it can be a little overwhelming looking at it all at once. I'm going to tell you what the map is showing and what everything means. So if you see that thin, meandering, light blue line, it kind of looks like a spaghetti noodle. That is the location of the wetlands on the property. Now, the reason that the wetlands are so narrow and consistent in width is that the wetlands area that they've mapped is actually Carver's Creek. That's a perennial creek that runs through the interior of this property and actually creates a nice, charming feature for the land. The crosshatched area alongside the creek is the flood hazard area. And in this part of the flood zone, this is like the part of the flood zone that's most prone to flooding, where except for like limited isolated circumstances, you actually can't build in the flood hazard at all. The light blue area is called the 100-year flood zone. And it's called that because statistically in 1 year out of 100 on average, you're going to have a flood that covers up the whole mapped area of the 100-year flood zone. So in other words, every year it's about a 1% likelihood that there's a flood that covers up that 100-year flood area. Now, the actual height of the floodwater above sea level is what is called the base flood elevation. And the base flood elevation is the height of the seawater of the 100-year flood zone in terms of number of feet above sea level. According to the state FRIS maps, that is 93.6 feet for this flood zone. Now, the 100-year flood is the part of the flood zone that is most synonymous with building regulations. Because when you build in a flood zone, a 100-year flood zone, depending on the county or city ordinance, typically in this location, what you have to do is make sure that the first floor of any new building is on the lowest level of the floor is at least the height of not only the base flood elevation, plus a 2 to 3 foot regulatory buffer that's called a freeboard. So when you look at a topography map on this property, what you find just looking downhill from the top of the property going down to the creek, what you see is that as you go west from Johnson Street into the property, you go downhill about 20 feet from about a 108-foot distance above sea level to between 84 and 88 feet above sea level, which is where the creek is located. So because the source of flooding is typically going to be a lower area of a property, that's why when you get into the 100-year flood zone, not all areas of the 100-year flood are created equal, because as you get further downhill towards the source of the flooding, what happens is that you have to create a higher distance to elevate your building foundation to meet the regulatory requirements. And so for that reason, if you have to build in a 100-year flood zone at all, typically to build towards the edge of the flood zone is going to be less onerous from a regulatory, engineering, and cost standpoint. So something just to consider. Now, the dark blue section of the periphery of the flood zone is what's called the 500-year flood zone. And that's a much greater flood event that's also much less likely to actually happen on any given year. In fact, it's going to happen about once every 500 years, which means that every single year on an annual basis, it's a 0.8 0.2% likelihood on an annual basis that you get that flood. Now, in this county and in many counties across the United States, the 500-year flood zone is basically exempt from regulations. So what that means is that if you're building and you're only building in the 500-year flood, but not the 100-year flood or flood hazard, often you're not going to have any additional regulations. They still map it so that you can see it, and some places do have regulations, so you want to double check that and not make assumptions, but that's the case here. Now, with that in mind, the question is, with just 1.7 acres outside the flood zone, do we actually have enough space here to build a home or let alone multiple homes on this property? Well, when you take measurements from the front of the property on Johnson Street to the front of the flood zone, what you find out is you've got anywhere from about 133 feet to 152 feet of buildable depth. But that buildable depth isn't that whole distance, because the front setback is going to be about 30 feet in this zoning district. What that means is that the first 30 feet in from the front of the property line, which means the first 30 feet west of the Johnson Street borderline, you cannot build. Then you also have a 50-foot riparian buffer from the creek. And what that means is that 50 feet away from any body of water, you also can't build either. And so generally, taking those two together, you have about 80 feet conservatively that's going to press against your buildable depth. But even so, you're still left with at least 53 to 72 feet of buildable depth, just depending on where you are on the front of the property. And the 50-foot measurement is cutting it a little close, but honestly, you have enough space here for a home, because that's a comfortable building location for even like a medium to large size single family residence. So even though you have the buildable depth in front of the creek, for all intents and purposes, that's really all the buildable depth you have on Tract A, because you're not going to build west of the creek, because that's a pretty big body of water, all things considered. And so to even get to the far side of that property with a car, you would have to build like a really sophisticated bridge, and the cost and engineering requirements of doing that are going to be cost prohibitive. And that's fine, because honestly, you don't need to build back there, because to put homes right up at the front and to have like a natural park environment in your backyard with a nice creek feature, nice water feature, that's all you really need. We don't have to like shoot for the moon, because we already have a pretty good property here. Now, in light of these environmental limitations that we're noting on the property, the big question is like, okay, what is this land actually worth? Like, what could this even sell for? Now, in the case of this property, the value of this land is actually going to be driven off of its potential to be subdivided into a series of smaller building lots. So the minor subdivide potential of the property affects how many potential homes could actually be built on this 12.6 acres of land. And a minor subdivide, for those who don't know, is the creation of between 2 and 6 new building lots from one larger building lot. And usually, depending on the local ordinances, you can split up to 6 new lots from an existing property, as long as each of the new properties has between 100 and 150 feet of road frontage onto a county maintained road. And so mileage may vary. Obviously, the regulations can differ from one place to the next, but every zoning office is going to have a minor subdivide ordinance. And so you can get the specific requirements from your county or city. But let's just say conservatively, if we have 500 feet of road frontage on Tract A onto Johnson Street, given a minimum road frontage requirement for new building lots in a minor subdivide, I'd say conservatively, you're going to have to put at least 150 feet of frontage, which means that we can technically have 3 new building lots just on Tract A. And to do that, I'm going to show an annotation of the map here where you can actually put 3 separate building lots, each with about 165 feet of road frontage, with a rectangular shape and boundary lines going straight back past and over the creek to the rear of the property. So each of those 3 potential home sites could have its own driveway and could also have its own home and its own section of private creek. So it's like a really kind of a nice way to add value to a property like this by offering more than one nice secluded home site in this area. Well, now when you go over to Tract B, what we could do here is we could actually split Tract B off into its own 3.6 acre home site with a driveway access coming in from Mary Jordan Lane. Now you may be wondering, if we have more than 150 feet of width of this property, like why wouldn't we try to split Tract B up into a couple or 3 properties here as well? The reason why is that Mary Jordan Lane to the east, your driveway here, it's a dirt road and it comes right up to the edge of the property, but there's really no clear public right-of-way along the front of the property there. And then on the other side to the west, you have the train tracks. So that's not really a driveway that you can use either. So for that reason, we would just take Tract B as like a standalone home site. And we probably wouldn't be able to subdivide that any further. Now, in terms of the market value of this potential subdivide, when you look at each of the 3 lots on Tract A, each with their own private creek, I think very conservatively, each of those could sell pretty quickly at $45,000 a piece. Now, the reason it wouldn't sell for more necessarily is because you actually have the highway overpass to the south, which creates like more or less constant highway noise depending on how far away you are from it. You also have the train lines across the street, so that's going to be a turnoff for a lot of people. And plus the highway noise, it's like kind of like industrial around you, so maybe not the best for every buyer, but still valuable, still really nice property. But when you look at tract B, the 3.6 acres over there, you are a little bit more insulated from the highway noise. Plus you're not going to see the train tracks, even though they're in your backyard. Like you have enough of a buffer, it really doesn't make that big of a difference. So for that reason, I think tract B on a standalone basis is going to be worth about $65,000. So if you add up the resale value of these 4 potential building lots, what you see is about $200,000 in market value in terms of resale. But I would take $10,000 off just for the cost of the subdivide survey plus the permitting. And $190,000 is probably a pretty good estimate for this kind of subdivide. However, for all of that to be true, and for me to do that subdivide and sell those building lots to buyers for the standpoint of building a future home, there's one thing that would need to be true. And that one thing is that on each of the 4 lots here, what I would need to do is make sure that I have soils that could be used for a conventional septic system on each of those 4 building lots. And the reason the soil matters is because to put a septic system in the ground, the actual engineering of the wastewater filtration and drainage at the end of the septic system is what's called a drain field. And your drain field needs to rely on the natural engineering of the soil to actually filter and drain the wastewater through the natural soil conditions. And in doing so, it purifies the wastewater. And it does it in a way that's way more advanced than you could do with anything you could make in a lab. And so soil itself is like way more advanced engineering than anything that you can buy. And to manage wastewater on a residential property like that, you just need certain types of drainage and certain drainage and depth to the soil on that location, or else you can't build a septic, which means if you don't have sewer, then you can't build a home. Now, when we got the soil map back, we didn't get the news that we wanted here, because what we found is that on tract B, it was totally unsuitable for conventional septic. The only type of septic system that we might be able to get on that property was an aerobic drip septic system. These are engineered septic systems that add another $30,000 in cost just on the septic, plus another $500 or more in annual maintenance costs. So I'd say just on the septic there, we're probably losing about $40,000 in market value on this property. So instead of selling at $65,000, I think that a price of closer to $25,000 is going to be more realistic for tract B. And that's kind of a blow to our resale value forecast. Now, tract A doesn't get any better really, because tract A, the majority of the property was unsuitable for any septic, meaning you couldn't even put an engineered septic on the majority of the soils in the front of that property. And then as you go further down towards the flood zone and the creek, it just gets worse and worse. So you couldn't even put septic on 2 of the 3 potential locations. And in the 3rd location, there was one area of soil on that property where you could put what's called a panel block septic system. Now, panel block septic is not technically a conventional septic. It's a little bit different, but it's similar enough in price that it still comes through as good news. Like, it doesn't really add any cost. So it's not going to affect the value of that property for like the standpoint of a single home site. But still, the soil report really hurt us on tract A for a couple specific reasons. Number one is that instead of having 3 potential home sites, we only have 1. And the home site that we do have is all the way in the southern southeastern corner of tract A, which puts that home closer to the highway, which means that that home is closer to the highway noise as well as to the cemetery on the southeastern edge of the property. There's a cemetery, guys. I forgot to mention the cemetery, but there is one. Also, the cemetery encroaches slightly across the southeastern property line, which is that ideal? No, it's not. I think we can all agree that's not great, that's not ideal, but it's fine. You can still work around it. And all this to say that instead of being worth $135,000 or so, blemishes and all, tract A on a standalone basis is probably worth more like $50,000 for all those issues taken together. And so what that means is that instead of being worth closer to 190 grand across the whole property, I think that the property's value is going to be more like 75,000. And I probably could have sold it for $75,000 too, but I ended up getting a really good cash offer at 66. $6,000, and I decided to leave a little bit of meat on the bone for the next owner. To be clear, like there's issues on this property, but I knew all about this. I knew all these issues of the land before I actually bought it. And that's why I was able to buy this land at $35,000 and make some money on the back end when I ended up selling it. The reason I made this video is to walk you through some basic environmental analysis to see how wetlands and flood zone can tangibly impact the development potential of a property, as well as the value of that land that you're looking at. Now, in this case, ironically, the extensive flood zone and the wetlands on this property didn't hurt the value of this land at all. In fact, it helped it because the flood zone and the wetlands emanate from a perennial stream in Carver's Creek that actually creates a natural feature that makes this land special and differentiated and really marketable for a retail buyer that wants to build a home. And so the actual wetlands and flood zone helped us a little bit. The thing that hurt us wasn't the flood zone or the creek. What hurt us is the soils, because we lost over $100,000 in market value, not from the wetlands, not from the flood zone, and not from the subdivision ordinance or any covenants or deed restrictions. What lowered the value of this land was that it had bad soil that you couldn't use for conventional septic systems. And in fact, up to 80% of the value of rural land in America is going to be determined by the soil conditions on that property that are so subtle that you can't even see them from the surface of the ground. And by the way, that's going to be the topic of our next video, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. So download the free checklist for land buyers due diligence if you haven't done so already, and enjoy the next video on our channel. I really had fun making this video, and I hope you enjoy the next one.